Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this event. My name is Sherry Lee, and I'm pleased to see you all here for a discussion about being in the weather, a combined listening session and a conversation about art, activism, and issues of climate change. I want to begin, I guess maybe I should say before I begin, which is a little bit awkward actually to begin saying something before you begin. The reason for the text setup is that we are webcast this evening. So I just wanted to let you know that. I wanted to begin by acknowledging the land that we are gathering on today. This land has been occupied by Indigenous peoples, many peoples from across the Turtle Island for thousands of years. They've been the caretakers of this land. I want to make a special acknowledgement of the Seneca, the Huron-Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and just to indicate how grateful we are to have the opportunity to be meeting here in this space today. I also want to thank all of you for being here. And I want to thank our sponsors and partners for this event because it has definitely been a collaborative endeavor. I'm very grateful to the Canadian Music Centre and to Matthew Fava, who makes all kinds of things in the world go round, and we definitely wouldn't be here without him. I want to thank the Faculty of Music and Dean Don McLean, who has graciously joined us today despite his hairy schedule. I'd like to thank Robin Elliott, the Chalmers Chair of Canadian Music at the Faculty of Music and the Director of the Institute for Music in Canada, who has also been a sponsor, and the Jackman Humanities Institute's program of strange weather this year was sort of the catalyst for us to have the opportunity to think about an event like this today. So I want to welcome our guests. We're really thrilled that we've had the opportunity to partner and have sponsorships to be able to bring people from far to think and talk about things and listen to things together. Hildegard Westerkamp doesn't need a whole lot of introduction, renowned soundscape composer, radio artist, and in fact, it's the history of Hildegard's work over decades that has inspired the event that we're getting together for today. So I'm very grateful to her for coming to visit us from Vancouver. Rachel Iwaasa has also come from Vancouver. Rachel is one of the most fearless pianists that I know, champion of the new, and also a great person to help us think about art and creativity and activism, I think, as the former director of the Vancouver Queer Arts Festival. And she's going to be performing some of Hildegard's works tomorrow evening, if you have the opportunity to see that. So thanks very much, Rachel, for being here. Daniel Grimley is a musicologist from Oxford University who's been working for a long time on concepts of music and landscape. And thinking about sound and place and environment has been really crucial to his work for many years now. And although I think a number of us have been thinking in a similar space for a while, this is really the first opportunity that we've had to speak directly to each other. So I want to thank Dan also for being here. And so let me just let you know very quickly what we thought we would do this evening. I have some questions that I'm very interested to hear about from the panel on the themes that we're going to be discussing today. We also want very much to have the opportunity for a listening session. So what we will do is open with a little bit of discussion, and then we will lower the lights and listen to the entirety of Hildegard Westerkamp's 1992 electroacoustic composition Beneath the Forest Floor. And then we'll discuss that a little more afterwards, and then we want to open up for an opportunity for questions and discussion from you. And also, because we have a live webcast, we may have some questions that come in remotely. If that happens, Matthew will relay those to me. But that's kind of what we thought that we would do. And then, when we finish at the end, you'll be welcome to stay around, have a second glass of wine and some snacks, and mingle and discuss the ideas that we've had here. I hope that sounds good. So if we can just begin perhaps as a continuation from, in a sense, from the land acknowledgement, by thinking a little bit about this issue of place and of the importance of being in a place and how it is that we feel about location and situatedness and the experience of place in relation to some of these themes. I mean, the title of the event today we took from a phrase from one of Dan's publications, that notion of being in the weather. And so, not that weather is a place per se, but we've certainly been feeling it in the place that we're in now. To maybe consider, I realize now we didn't formalize an order of response or anything, but maybe we can hear from Hildegard, but I'm happy to just have the panel jump in as they will to talk a little bit about the significance of place and weather and of being there.
Sure. I think I'd like to start with something that occurred yesterday when I went to High Park to meet a friend to have some lunch and to walk. And I got out at the train station at High Park, and I'd never been there, or if I have, it was years ago. And I walked up, came out to the entrance hall, and there was an older man sitting in a wheelchair with a bowl collecting money. Certainly somebody who seemed homeless, seemed very, very poor. And I was looking at him, and there was something about him that I just really wanted to give him something. And so I did. I stopped and I got some money out, and as I was doing that and he held his cup out, he said to me, "I want to be in an igloo." And then he repeated that. And I said, "I completely understand. I can feel it, that you want to be in an igloo." And he was smiling. And it was just an amazing disconnected scene. Here we were in this very ugly hall, and here he was all alone, and some people came in and out. And he kept saying, "I want to be in an igloo." And so we had a little conversation, and then I walked away. We waved at each other. And then a lady came out with me, just sort of happened to be there, and she says, "Isn't he amazing?" She knew him. Like, obviously he had been. Does anybody know him, perhaps, from that station? It sounds like he's been there often enough that people recognize him. Obviously Inuit. And it was a very moving scene that instantly makes you think about place.
Mm-hmm.
And instantly makes you just think about what would it be like to be in an igloo and to know it so well. It's your home. It's where you feel absolutely welcome, connected to the land, connected to the weather. And I mean, I did not, later I thought maybe I would really like to stop a little longer and ask him, "How long have you been in this place?" And I don't know anything about him other than that. So I just wanted to bring that up here because I think we all have a strong connection to some place that connects us on many, many levels, viscerally, physically, in terms of nostalgia, in terms of memory, in terms of the acoustic environment, the weather, all of that, where we just simply know that our body is at home. And to think about that in a world where we are all migrating all the time, I think is quite important to perhaps begin to identify where do we feel at home and why, and what happens to us when we do migrate and move through the world a lot. Refugees, tourists, immigrants, the whole world is moving at the moment. And over the years of my lifetime, I've begun to feel that the act of listening to not just the environments that we live in and that we call home and the ones that we travel into, but also to listen to how we respond to them. How do we listen to them? What do they tell us? And how do we react to them? That we begin to understand our relationship to the environment in a clearer way, in terms of articulating it and understanding our own perception more.
Yes, I think that focus on listening and place is absolutely crucial. And Hildegard, that's what I think I've always taken away from your work and found very rewarding. I should come clean and say that the phrase being in the weather comes from an article by the anthropologist Tim Ingold, who is based in Aberdeen in the northeast of Scotland, where the weather is certainly strange and very changeable. And he talks about being in the weather as a process of opening oneself up to all sorts of affordances that the weather then affects within you as a being. So it's really a question about agency and about transformation, and I think a certain kind of fragility, which is, for Ingold, one of the ways in which we are human and we interact with the world around us. So I found that a very productive way of starting to think about the relationship between sounds and music and place. But I was also bothered by the idea that there are places where people cannot go, where that affordance is not voluntary, where it is enforced, or it is bound up with a process of displacement. So migration as something that is not elective, but something that's part of a history of domination. And that's what got me thinking through places of music history and thinking about what happens to those sites where displacement has occurred. How do we hear that displacement? How do you register those voices? Particularly given that the way in which music is such a complex material, immaterial medium, and how do we try and capture those voices that are absent, which we do not hear, where there is no material trace. And then it seems to me that we absolutely need place and need to think through the idea of what it means to be in place or be out of place in order to try and hear those voices more carefully again. And I feel that ever more urgently, both given the crises that the world is facing right now, but also as a kind of scholarly imperative as the academy is under threat, that we need to open the academy out to those voices that have been excluded and to allow other people to come into these places and make these places their home as well. So I see it as a challenge, I see it as a scholarly mission, I see it as a token of this environmental catastrophe that we're facing, and I also see it kind of as a methodology. So all sorts of ways in which I think those ideas get bundled up, but listening is absolutely the key to that. Listening and responsiveness and the responsibility that comes with that. And I don't think that's easy.
Yeah, it's awkward to talk about place and displacement here on unceded land with no Indigenous voices on the panel. Mm-hmm. And, you know, as we think about climate change and the crisis that we're at with as a result of unfettered resource extraction, I mean, the roots of that are ultimately the same roots as what bring us to this place where we can have a forum talking about place with nobody from who comes from this unceded territory. It's the same idea of I see, I want, I take that's brought us to both places.
Thanks for that reminder, Rachel. I feel as though listening is part of the beginning of a response to that challenge as well. We should take some time to engage in listening before we talk more and make more sound ourselves, I think. I don't want to give a long précis to the piece, but I do want to say just briefly, among all of the things that we could have listened to, there are a few things that draw us to Beneath the Forest Floor in particular, or at least that drew me to ask Hildegard if this was the piece in particular that we could listen to, and she has agreed to that. I find her discussion, your discussion of the piece in the notes that you wrote at the time that the album was released, to be quite compelling and to raise really interesting issues for us to continue to think about. And I encourage you all to online access the full write-up of the notes for the piece, because they're too lengthy for me to read through them now, and that would be a bit anticlimactic anyway. But one of the things you say there, Hildegard, is that you sort of conclude that note by saying that this work, which is recorded in and is about the Carmanah Forest on the West Coast, that you hope it will encourage people to consider going to that place. And this is one of the reasons that we opened with a discussion of place here, but also how crucial it is that the act of listening might be something that would encourage that sort of engagement with that endangered environment. And so I appreciate the way you linked listening and place in that discussion there. Do you want to say anything to us about the piece before we hear it?
Yeah, maybe just point out the fact that it's an old-growth forest that was at the time in danger. Half of it had already been logged, and by the time I got in there with my microphones, the other half had become park, had been preserved because of the incredible work of the Western Canada Wilderness Committee at the time, an environmental group on the West Coast. And and I had never really gone into an old-growth forest of that magnitude, really. It's an amazing place. And I hadn't really this was a commission by the CBC, and one of the reasons I went there was very almost technical or practical in a way, because they wanted me to work here in Toronto in their first all-digital facility. And they urged me not to go recording, but not to do anything with those sounds until I get to this new studio. And that was very scary to me because I have never worked with a technician and I've always worked alone. And I thought, okay, then if that's the case, we're in the sort of clean technology land of the studio. I'm going to go into the most quiet place I can find on the West Coast, and I'm going to go to an old-growth forest. And it happened to be that there was the political issue of logging at the same time in that place, and that, of course, because I'm an activist on a deep level too, that appealed to me. So all I did is just get a really, really good microphone, renting a really good microphone, and otherwise very portable. And so that was the choice of the place. I had really no idea, other than imagining what I might get, what kinds of sounds I would get. And then, as it goes with field recording, you go and you record and you get what you get from that place. You get the sort of the gifts of the soundscape from that place. And then the composition follows after that. The language of the environmental sounds that you've recorded guide you into a composition. And there is no structure ahead of time. There is no imposed already existing structure. So the sounds themselves really led me into the structure, and I can tell you more details about that later. And so, yes, I think I'm just going to stop saying anything else and just maybe you will get your own sense of this piece, and you will get your own sense of how can you relate this to a place, or does it take you closer to a place? And you might want to discuss that afterwards. Is it in fact something that would encourage you to go out there? Who knows? I mean, that was just an idealistic statement in my program note, really. and wanting to say, come on, you guys, you've got to see this, because if you don't, you've got to see this and hear this, because if you don't, we do not know what these forests are like after they get logged. if we don't know the forests that get logged, we don't know what old growth forests are actually like, right? And so because we had pathways built into that environment, it became accessible to people and to us urban people. It was accessible to people all along, really, through the animal paths. But the Western Canada Wilderness Committee encouraged this walking into the land by building these paths and inviting people in. So really, to me, any composition is a framework for an opportunity to sink into your own listening and get an idea of what the sounds that you're hearing, what are they giving you, really?
Thanks so much. Beneath the Forest Floor is a work of 17.5 minutes duration. Hildegard has suggested that we listen with the lights down, so I'm going to ask Matthew to dim the lights now, and then we listen.
neglected something terribly. I didn't do a sound check listening to the piece before, and I found it too loud. I'm sorry, Matthew. I would have probably put it down a few notches. So if you felt that it was just being a bit too aggressive for an old growth forest, no, you didn't think so? Really? Okay.
I found it wonderfully immersive, actually. I was deeply into that listening experience. I hope everyone felt that this place afforded that opportunity. I wonder if I can just ask you something, Rachel, kind of fairly directly, that follows on from the last thing we talked about before we listened to the piece, which is this idea that the way Hildegard framed that piece in terms of her notes from the album makes it, to me, gives it a sort of a sense of activism, because it was like a call to do something, to engage in something. I urge you to go to this place and do this thing. And so I mean, we had an opportunity last night actually to chat a little bit. There's been a lot of movements, of activist movements surrounding issues and concerns of climate change. We've had a couple of global climate strikes, climate marches here in Toronto. I'm interested to hear your thoughts about activist engagement from an artist perspective, or not even particularly from an artist perspective, whether that relates to your history and working with queer arts, or more generally in terms of the issues that we're talking about today.
That's a big question, Sherry.
Sure, Rachel. I want to leave it as open for you as you like.
I think as a classically trained musician who's grew up in an activist household, finding the place that would meld my arts practice and my compulsion to feel like I'm making the world a better place, it was not an easy place to find that marriage. And I think that's something that many of us struggle with. The sense of the deep love that we have for the art form in which we're trained, and the struggle to find relevance and how to deal with so many of the parts of it that are problematic. I don't know that I have much insight to offer people on that. I stumbled in it a little bit by accident, by looking for something fun to do for Pride and ending up with a whole bunch of other people starting a festival that's now become a year-round gallery, some gallery in Vancouver. But I'm going to steer the question a little bit in a slightly different direction based on the conversation that we had last night, which was, as we kind of prepared for this panel, one of the things that we ended up talking about is, how do we know that our activism is having an effect? And, we do these things, we have these climate marches, we try to find ways in which to change the world, whether it's as an activist, as an artist activist, or whether simply as a citizen activist. And I guess one of the things that I want to say to that I have to bring to the table with that is that I am living proof that activism can have an effect. At the end of World War II, the government had made a move to deport all of Japanese Canadians from Canada. It was an activist movement by young Japanese Canadians and others that meant that planned deportation didn't happen, which meant that my father stayed in Canada and met my mother, and here I am today. And that one was door-to-door knocking and a letter-writing campaign, which are the kinds of things that often feel, when we feel like we're impotent and that the things that we do don't have much effect, we never know from this end whether what we're going to do is going to have an effect. And then we're only going to know from the other side of history. And I think, as we try to choose our actions, and all we can know is that we don't know, and that it's not about finding the one right way to do this. It's about recognizing that we need multiple strategies for survival, and to allow for those, allow that people will not like the way that we're doing it, and we may not like the way that other people are doing it, but ultimately we don't know which way is going to be successful. So, we all focus on trying as we will and seeing what happens.
Just before I open for questions from everyone, including from anyone who might be joining us on live stream, I want to ask you one more question, Dan, that follows on from something you said almost in passing. I think about when you were glossing Ingold and you were talking about the importance of listening to sound, something that is there and then not there, or something that ends. And so I thought you might have a few comments to make about the discourse of sustainability that is so predominant in our concerns for climate change today, and how listening and sound relates to that.
Because I think the other challenge and the tension that underpins what Rachel's talking about is timescale, and the urgency for action now and the desire for deliverable results now versus the long time scale of natural processes that vastly out-sustain the duration of a human life. And actually I think this is one way of thinking about Hildegard's piece, which is that, Hildegard, I think your piece plays with time in very clever ways. So I think there's something of the Urwald about it, which is that when you're listening to this piece, you feel that it's always been there and it's always going on. And at the same time, Urwald, I did, and I think it's all that kind of forest which is somehow outside time, but of course it isn't, because it's both in these very, very particular moments that one encounters that sound or that instant and tries to capture it, and then it's gone. And I think there are all sorts of very now politicized metaphorical readings that one can draw out from that, to do with trying to hold on to what is lost and the experience of loss and the opportunity for immersion in something which you know to be vanishing. And that might be these remarkable old growth forests. And actually the historical press I was thinking of wasn't so much the Germanic Urwald that it could have been. It was old growth Tasmanian forest in Australia, which was also heavily logged, and where there was a very strong activist campaign in the 1970s, which also used music and used photography and used image to try and raise awareness of what that forest was like. And that's in a landscape that's also marked by horrific genocide of Aboriginal population. So this is also a very dark place, but it's a place that can offer solace and refuge. And so I think the ambivalence that I hear in your piece, which is also, I think, the ambivalence that underpins the relationship between creative practice, scholarly work, and political activism, is one around, so where do we locate agency? Where do we find responsibility? Where do we place ourselves in that process? How can we make a contribution in the awareness that individually we can't hold back that tide? And I think it comes back to listening, that listening is the starting point and the end point.
And I mean, both of your storytelling about the Japanese situation and your storytelling about the Tasmanian situation, the combination of storytelling through words and then recording environmental sounds as a type of language that speaks of a place, just because the place contains these kinds of sounds, and so they become the language with which we speak about it. And so sometimes I'm thinking more of myself as a writer of sound rather than a composer, because the sounds are just like words, information. And the title Beneath the Forest Floor came about during the process of doing the piece because I discovered a lot of darkness in the sounds that I had recorded and then slowed down in the studio, and there was this underworld of sound coming out. And of course it makes a lot of sense now when there's all these wonderful books now and scientific studies about the underground connections between trees. It's fabulous just to, and I think we've always sensed that about forests. We always know that there's something about forests that touches us deeply, and it's both dark and very alive at the same time. And I feel that the listening, recording, sound-making process through environmental sounds, it allows us to stop for a moment and contemplate forest as what does it mean to us? What is, I think what I said in the program now, the inner forest in us, or the forest in us, what does that mean? And how does the forest relate, the roots of the forest relate to our inner roots, really, yeah.
I'm sure that there are questions or points of discussion that some of you would like to raise. We do have a microphone so that any questions that you ask will also be audible to anyone who's joining us through the webcast, although you won't be visible to them on the camera. I'm also going to keep my eye on the screen in case Matthew sends me any questions that come in from the webcast, but I do want to open the floor in case anyone has a question, a thought, a point that they would like to raise. And while you're thinking about that, I'll just mention this is the first event in a week-long series of events that is sponsored by the Jackman Humanities Institute's Strange Weather themed year. And so tomorrow evening, the Faculty of Music, part of the New Music Festival, is the Keyser Prize Festival, and Rachel will be performing works of Hildegard there, and Hildegard will also be diffusing another one of her works. There's a free public sound walk on the UTSC campus on Wednesday morning. Dan Grimley is giving a lecture at the Faculty of Music on Thursday afternoon, and there's another sound walk on the St. George campus early on Friday afternoon. Matthew does have posters, information about the event series, so you're all welcome. Are there comments, questions, volleys, challenges coming from? Okay, there's a question right here in the front corner. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for your time and for the really, really interesting conversation so far. Quick side note, I'm actually from Tasmania.
Right, so what I was thinking of is the Lake Pedder campaign and Allegus Trajanus, actually. So that's presumably you're familiar with both as images and also the environmental legacy and the birth of the Green Party in Tasmania.
Absolutely. A little bit before my time, but definitely within my scope of understanding and sort of brings a vivid image to mind. And I also lived in Vancouver for a little while, so a lot of parallels starting to draw in my mind here. And I wanted to keep on topic, I think, of the weather, but I wanted to shift and question a little bit about place, which is that I've been thinking a lot about, as a sort of urban person, as you say, Hildegard, I've been thinking about as an urban person how I listen in cities and really thinking deeply about that interaction of nature and the city, and to sort of put my opinion out there. I'm very fond of the sound of the city, and I take great pleasure in the city. And it's obvious that you took great pleasure in making this recording in the wilderness, and I think that this conversation, I would just be very interested, and I'm a little bit vague here, but I'll just try and direct this to a question. I'm interested to know what your thoughts are here and now on the topic of place and the topic of listening in cities, and wondered if you might have any thoughts amongst the panel. This is certainly for everyone. Thank you.
I have tons of opinions about that. I can give you a whole lecture. It's absolutely crucial that we listen to cities. And it doesn't matter where we listen. If you go on a sound walk listening to any place, it has a grounding effect simply because you are listening. And this is what I learned from working with Murray Schafer in the World Soundscape Project in the 70s, is that really we need to listen, we really need to learn to listen to everything, because we have an issue of noise out there. That noise doesn't necessarily belong only to the city. I mean, we have heard this chainsaw in the forest, right? That was part of the piece. But there's moments of noise in very, very quiet environments. There's the dichotomy of city noise, bad, nature, quiet, good, does not work. It's not what this is about. It's about, let's open our ears to the city, to Toronto, and find out, what is this place? And we cannot always open our ears to a whole city. I mean, we tried that with the Vancouver Soundscape. We tried to give a sort of a portrait of a whole city, but that was perhaps just because it was so new and we were inexperienced. It's really not possible to give a portrait of a city. Really, what is possible is that we listen to it, and we may find a relationship to the city through the listening, and therefore we might get our portrait of what the city is, and every one of us may do that, and as a collective we may get an idea of what is this city actually, right? Because there's a multitude of levels and layers, and you can never cover everything at all, right? So that's just the beginning of my lecture.
But I think it's important to stress that cities are no less places of displacement than first growth forest can be. So I think the question always has to be, how are you able to gain access to that point of the city? Who are you who are listening, who is not there, who's not been able to get access? So I think that cities are no less socially and politically registered than other kinds of places. And so I think those sounds are never neutral, and they're never unhistorical objects either. And I think that about that when I'm walking around a city like London, that the sights and sounds of particular places in London will have changed depending on whether you're in the East End as a Jewish migrant in the 1910s or 1920s, or a Bangladeshi migrant in the 1950s, 1960s, and thinking about the East End of London now as a rapidly gentrifying area, and the sounds are very different. And then who has access to those sounds? So I think all those questions come with this idea of the city as a zoned and complex and mediated place.
That's what I was wondering about, the historical nature of the Vancouver Soundscape Project, and Hildegard, how you feel about that now, because you just said it's not possible to make a portrait of a city, and yet there must be so much tape from a very particular time and place.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether you all heard the question about the Vancouver Soundscape and the sort of historical nature of that. And of course, when we were studying Vancouver at the time, it really was a very new thing. I mean, nobody had really done that. And so we were very excited about the fact that we could record it all. It was a new technology. It was a time of discovery. And through listening and recording, we could try to record as much as possible. And certainly as a relatively new immigrant at the time, I'd been in Canada for 5 years. To me personally, that study was stunning, because it made me feel like I was connecting to this new place in a very special way. And the word grounding always comes up for me, because there's something else that happens when you listen to a place that connects you with the flow of time. It puts you into the present. You can't help being in the present when you listen consciously. So as Michael Stoker put it really well, the sound is the unfolding of the continuous now. And when you think of that as a way of being in the present of the continuous now, you can't help letting you're not so much inclined letting your mind run ahead of you with a lot of busyness and hectic. It allows you to stop and be in this time, and therefore connect with, find a new relationship to it, really. That's what soundscape is. And so my relationship certainly changed to Vancouver because of that study. But when I say that you can't do a whole city, there's tons of critiques now about our work because we did not deal with indigenous people. We did not deal with certain parts of the city, the downtown east side, for example, or we didn't deal with different races. It was all very white. Yes, there's a lot of things that we did not do as a result. And I'm thinking about this and thinking, yeah, really, we didn't even, yes, we did some work with indigenous people, and they are part of the document of that, but really very much in passing. And thinking back to that time, that was not the priority, not even in the country. Right? In the atmosphere of the country now, yes, we are all very much alerted. At that time, we were not so much alerted, and certainly we as a group were not so much alerted, but we were very excited about the fact that we could record everything, and we even had Vancouver Cooperative Radio in Vancouver at the time, and we could use the radio station to give voice to things that had never been given voice on the radio. And so we thought we were really politically very far ahead, and we were pushing boundaries, and we were very excited about all this, right? And it's true, that's what happened. But a lot of things did not happen. And it made me, from this perspective, it makes me think, I'm very grateful for these kind of perspectives now and critiques now, because it really starts to make you think about the atmosphere of an age and the language of an age and the way we listen. What do we focus on? What do we not focus on? And we are now in this age. And so let's listen to what are the main issues now. And so because there was that lack, now we really need to do it much more. So, right? So I'm very grateful that we did it. It's part of the process of time passing and us doing research and finding out more and more and more about sound and about listen and how we listen. And now we have arrived at this stage, and the younger generation pushes its boundaries. And I think there's so much richness in that kind of listening to that process all the time.
I think we could take one more question or comment. Matthew, I've been watching my screen. I'm not sure if you have any questions that you're sending me from the live stream, or we could maybe take one more comment or question from the floor here. Is there another? No, I'm just looking to see if anyone has another.
I'd like to speak a
any
little
question
about
or
that
issue. Okay,
question
please
here,
do,
though,
Rachel. We
just
do have a
briefly while
minute. Yeah.
It's interesting because I hadn't really thought much about your soundscape project when I started doing I've been doing a project this past year inspired by Tina Pearson of performing John Cage's 433 around the gallery where where I work, both in the building and as I'm gradually moving out into the streets as well. This idea, we think Cage, people often talk about Cage's 433 as being, 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. But he says himself, it's not silence. It's just a sound that happens that was nobody could have foreseen ahead of time. And what's striking to me about it is that it makes me listen to things that I didn't, it's about listening to things we didn't think were worth listening to. Right? And it's telling that I've always wondered how he picked 433. And then recently was playing a piece by Jeffrey Ryan where he's points out that Oscar Wilde's cell number was C33, C being the symbol for 4 in music, and then 33. So that, I mean, Jeff has written a piece on Oscar Wilde, so the time signatures are 433, 433, 433 all the time. And after, as I was counting my way through this, I was like, oh, 433, that's familiar. But that's, it's something I would actually encourage everyone to do, because there's an app for that now. That's how Peters publishes 433. So you can take your cell phone out and perform 433 in. It's an interesting thing to do outside of the concert hall, as a way of listening, to the world, and again of thinking about those sounds that we often don't think are worth listening to.
It's another good call to listen. I think maybe that is a good opportunity for us. Oh, is there one question?
Yes.
There's one question. Okay, let's have one question.
Yeah, hi. Actually, just as a follow-up to your conversation about Cage's 433, about, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, there was a conference on Cage here, and I heard a lecture about that piece. And the original premiere was done in somewhere in New England, and it was in August, and it was outside in an abandoned church or something. I don't know if I got all my details straight, but basically it was the sound of, the summer night, that he brought people together to listen to. So, and that's some research by somebody in Victoria whose name I can't remember. But anyway, my question was about how we bring the body into place. Well, you're talking about place and listening, and I'm wondering where does body fit? Where does body fit into this conversation?
Sometimes it doesn't fit. Sometimes it doesn't fit, and that can be voluntary or enforced. I think that's part of the sort of tension in place, is that place can be disembodied violently or otherwise, or it can be profoundly bodied. And actually, to go back to Ingold for a second, that was his starting point, was really talking about what does it mean to feel in place, and he's trying to develop a rhetoric or a method for talking about what does it mean to be a body in place, and what is the relationship between place and body. And there's a long academic literature from Bachelard, and other writers on place as embodied space, and the performance of that place through bodily presence. And that's, I think that's productive, but we cannot lose the political angle that bodies are never just there.
I'd like to just also say that the listening body is our whole being, our whole body listening to the sound. So we're not just we forget that it's not just our ears that are receiving sound, and so. If you know of Evelyn Glennie, who is a performing percussionist who is deaf, and when she teaches other deaf people to perform, she teaches how our body listens. She is so sensitized to the vibrations of the vibrations of sound that are in the room. She can feel them in different parts of the body where they resonate. We are simply desensitized. We don't know enough about that. We could be trained to be that kind of body as ear concept almost, right? And then I'm thinking the balance to all that is the voice. And when we are receiving a lot of sound, how are we speaking back? How are we relating through our voice to the environment? What is the balance between the reception of sound and the making of sound in our lives? And to me, that's also a deeply ecological question. Like, are we able? And now I'm not talking about recording environmental sounds. I'm talking about being without any technology, being in the environment, receiving all this sound, say in a very busy, noisy environment. what happens to our expression and our voices in that context? And are we still able to speak, to sing, to make sounds? And there, if you want, there's a whole thesis that I wrote about that particular thing in relation to the use of music in starting with the Muzak Corporation, starting with all the music that we hear in the world. What happens to our voices, our singing voices, our speaking voices in the face of an inundation of musical sounds all the time? And so there, at that point, are we still able to represent our full embodied voice through a full voice into the environment? And, getting back to indigenous questions, I remember one of the most striking experiences I had many, many years ago was when there was a court case against the Haida Nation in Vancouver. And they had to come down for this court case. And they came down and they were able to assert that before the court case started, they were going to do their singing and drumming in the courtroom. In other words, they were bringing their culture and their place into the Vancouver courtroom. And, I was still a new immigrant, and I absolutely couldn't believe it. It just created this atmosphere of, what's the word? Identity, them giving us their culture and identity into this room, that it shifted the tone of that court case. It was amazing. Yeah. Yeah. Does that answer it a bit? Yeah.
I always think of Whitman, I sing the body electric, and I wish he'd written I hear the body electric. I think that's implied within the verse, because that verse is about singing being a body into place.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much to all of you for being here. Thank you for this call to listening that we've experienced and the listening opportunity that we've had. I hope that will continue to consider listening as precisely an opportunity for relationality with each other, as well as with environment and that theme that has brought us together today. I want to thank Hildegard Westerkamp and Kiyo Iwaasa and Daniel Grimley for being with us. I want to thank you all for joining. Please feel free to continue the conversation. Thanks very much for being here.